Um, Hello, everyone. On behalf the E+ Institute, I'm very excited to welcome all of you to this side event during the New York Climate Week. I'd like to thank the team responsible for organizing E+ events and making everything happen during this busy week. The other events are available at E+ website. And of course, thank the specialists who have accepted our invitation to take part in this panel. I'd like to briefly introduce E+. E+ is a Brazilian think tank, one of the most important civil society organizations in Brazil, and plays a great role influencing policies and promoting the energy transition and industry decarbonization as structural elements for socioeconomic development in Brazil. And during this conversation, we are going to explore the connections between the the G20, discussion and the upcoming COP30 in Belém, Brazil, next year. We will also talk about the opportunities of having G20 Troika with countries from the Global South, India, Brazil, and South Africa, the next G20 presidency. This marks a significant shift in power dynamics within the G20, as these three nations are now playing a key role influencing global economic policies and decisions. And all of this highlights to us the importance of the emerging economies in shaping the international agenda, particularly when it comes to fighting inequality, climate change, and promoting just energy transition. I think I will briefly introduce our panelists, then when they start to take part on the conversation, I will talk more about each one. So they will share with us their experience in G20 and talk about the critical paths to success, not only at COP30, but also at G20 under South Africa presidency, both happening next year. Fernanda Denigri from the Institute for Applied Economic Research, IPEA, Brazil. Shubha Hara from the Council on Energy, Environment and Water, India, an important Asian think tank. Inácio Lara from Assuntos del Sur, Argentina. Natalia Tsuyama from the Secretary of State for Social Development from Minas Gerais and Engajamundo. And Jordan McLean from the South African Institute of International Affairs, SAIA, also an important think tank. And I am Teresa Liporassi, a board member of E+ Institute, and I will moderate this panel. So I'd like to start this conversation with Fernanda Denigri. Fernanda holds a PhD in economics from the University of Campinas and is the director of the Division of Production and Innovation Studies at the Institute for Applied Economic Research. She previously led the Office of Monitoring and Evaluation at the Ministry of Science, Technology and Innovation, and served as an economic advisor to the Ministry of Industry and Foreign Trade. Fernanda's research focuses on foreign trade, investment, innovation, and productivity. Fernanda, please, could you share with us your experiences as coordinator of Think Tank 20 during the G20 Brazil? It was a very important and challenging role, you know. And in your view, what important connections can be drawn between the initiatives and collaborations from the G20 and COP30, which will also be hosted in Brazil next year? And how can the success from G20 discussions inform and enhance our approach to the challenges we face at COP30? You have 10 minutes, 10, 12 minutes, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Teresa, and thank you for the invitation to be part of this panel. It's a very important discussion, and I would like to congratulate you for inviting all these think tanks to have this conversation. Well, first of all, it was a great pleasure for our institution, the Institute for Applied Economic Research, to coordinate the G20 group under the Brazilian presidency of G20 this year. It was very informative. It was very important for us to take part in these discussions. As you know, G20, the Brazilian presidency in G20 put inequality in the center of discussion. And that is the point I would like to start my conversation with you. And why that is important. We know that we think we have two big challenges in the global economy right now, the two most important challenges. One is, of course, climate change, and another one is inequality. And if you take the big picture, the most rich, the top one, 10% of the world population owns 76% of the wealth and accounts for 48% of global carbon emissions. While the bottom 50% of the poorest people in the world account only for 12% of global emissions. So that's a huge problem if you think that if the poorest people in the world have the same life standards that we have, or that that some of all have, there will no planet to everyone. So we have to think about climate change, and we have at the same time, we cannot afford to reduce global economic growth and development. And how we do that, I think that is the most important challenge of our days. And that's why Brazil put inequality in the center of this discussion. And give the same importance to the redistributive aspects of climate change, and a strong emphasis in the links between poverty and climate change. The idea is that climate and other aspects of development are intrinsically linked. The task force 2 of the T20 group is dedicated, therefore, to addressing critical facets of climate action, with particular emphasis on issues related to energy transitions and with a central focus on inclusivity and justice. And it was structured around 7 thematic subtopics, which prioritize the following issues. First of all, developing policy proposals to ensure that the necessary shift towards sustainable energy is inclusive and fair for all. The second thematic group was oriented to accelerate the shift towards sustainable consumption and production patterns, while decoupling economic growth from environmental degradation and use of natural resources. The third one was oriented to foster a shared understanding of the concepts of social bioeconomy and nature-based solutions, because we think that it's important to preserve the environment at the same time that generate alternative of income for population living in several areas, for instance, Amazon forest. So they are the quality of the income of these populations are related with climate and biodiversity and um, uh, could minor this crisis. Uh, the fourth group was oriented to promoting low carbon infrastructure investments that foster inclusivity, resilience, and sustainability across society. Optimizing access to multilateral and climate funds and leverage private capital for climate finance was also an important concern of the T20 group, the, the second, the task force two. And finally, proposing ways to operationalize the concept of climate justice by ensuring equitable access to financing and technology transfer. Uh, there is a recent report from the International Energy Agency that says that the climate goals will not be achieved without more investment in research and development, because some of technologies that could help us to achieve these goals are not still used, are not still ready for the market. So it will be necessary investment and technology, and that will also be necessary to invest in technology transfer for less developed countries. And finally, the task force two also aims to contribute to greater transparency, accountability, and standardization of environmental, social, and governance ESG metrics and taxonomies. I think that that's the big picture of the work that the T20 has done on the topic of climate change. And I think there are several lessons that I probably will have the opportunity to share with you in the next few minutes.
Thank you, Fernanda. Yes, I think it's Brazil, G20 was has a very important role, giving this focus on inequalities, putting inequalities in the center of the discussions. And this, I think this can drive in the way we, especially for the global south, but how the things have to go when talking about climate finance, investment in top technology, and sharing technology with the less developed countries. So, yes, thank you for share your experience. And let me turn it over Shuva. Shuva is the head of the International Cooperation Portfolio at the Council on Energy, Environmental and Water. She leads efforts in energy development and climate, focused on decarbonization, sustainable finance, and climate resilience. She also advises on India's engagement with G20, Quad, and other multilateral initiatives, and has been a UNEP CCC COP observer since 2016. Shuva, last year, you played an active role in G20 discussion in India, and your contributions were also very important for the Brazil G20 presidency. As we look ahead to the G20 Brazil, how do you see the progress on energy transition initiatives evolving from India to Brazil? And additionally, I'd like to hear from you, what steps do you believe Brazil can take at COP30 to build on the work accomplished over the past 2 years?
Thank you, Teresa, and it's a privilege for me to be here. Thanks, everyone, for the contribution so far to this conversation. And I'm really waiting to hear what everybody else has to say because it's a valuable conversation to have. And I want to sort of highlight the title that you've taken for your event, which is from G20 to COP30, etc., which really indicates that it's a continued conversation. It's not one and done. It's not one event. There is a continuity of discussion and process and decision and legislation at the international and national and even subnational levels in our countries. The other thing I want to immediately highlight from the session itself, while we have the current troika on, I also want to acknowledge that Indonesia was the first in this current series. So there are four developing countries that have held the conversation. So I actually first started getting involved in this process from Italy before it came to Indonesia, because India had entered the troika at that point. So it was Italy, Indonesia, and India, and that's when we started researching it. And it was um, fairly enlightening for us to see that the conversation had been very developed country centric, very finance and economy in a very limited sense. And there was sort of little hints of climate change or little hints of energy efficiency or such included as token conversation. So from there to now, where sustainable development has taken primacy in the G20 conversation, I think that much of that is attributed to the current set of countries that are leading the agenda. There are a couple of points that I want to make in this context, and I want to start. I also want to mention that in the India G20, the African Union has been brought in. And it's interesting because at one point they were not considered relevant for a G20 conversation because it was very, again, GDP centric or economic growth centric, and it's now development centric. So this is a change in the G20 itself. Similar things have been happening at COP. You mentioned that I've been at COPs since 2016, so it's a long journey. COPs itself themselves, have gone from having a very narrow climate focus to now being, again, a broader conversation where we have discussions on water, we have other resources, biodiversity. So all these conversations have broadened, and that has brought me into the think tank space as well, because now these dots have to be connected across sectors. So we cannot have these siloed conversations of one track, one point of view, and one outcome that is desired from all of these. And that brings us to where Global South is at this point of time, because you mentioned that emerging economies now are at the global high table. So what do we have to do about that? The first is to acknowledge that we are not a homogeneous set of countries. There are about 143 developing countries. Within that, you have a whole bunch of different, criteria. But the most important thing to acknowledge, and I think, we just heard a little bit of that from Fernanda, is that a lot of us were under colonial rule till very recent. So our independence is very recent. So the current countries and their development stages are fairly nascent in the modern history of the world. So they're kind of rebuilding from very difficult past, including India. I mean, we got our independence in 1947. It's been a very difficult journey since then. So we have to acknowledge that you're starting not from a position of strength, but you're rebuilding, and that has to be factored in over here in taxonomy or classification on the resources that we have. And the other important thing is that Global South has regional groupings. We need to move into strategic groupings from there. So it's not that just because you're in South America that all South American countries should have a grouping, or you're in East Asia, so all East Asian countries have a grouping. No, we can have strategic groupings cutting across continents. The G20, but other forums such as, for example, BRICS, etc., also are now giving us that opportunity beyond the United Nations to kind of have for us to talk about in a strategic way. The very large, dense populations that these countries have, they also, all of them do not, like India, for example, is an energy consuming country. We have to import a lot of fossil fuels. So we started going towards clean energy, renewable energy out of an energy security issue during the oil shocks of the 70s. But there are countries in the global south whose revenue comes from the sale of fossil fuels and so on and so forth. So till we find a replacement revenue sources for these countries, to unilaterally say that stop this, stop that, has massive impacts on the people of those countries. And we have to be cognizant of the SDGs. And I want to take a moment to remind us of the SDGs in the order, because we forget about this when we group them together, is that SDG 1 is poverty, 2 is no hunger, 3 is good health, 4th is education, 5th is gender equality, 6th is clean water. Then we have affordable and clean energy. And then if you see, we have work and economic growth, and then we have industry and infrastructure. And Developing countries are trying to do all of these at the same time. So the prioritization cannot be one or the other. It's happening in parallel because we have not peaked in our economies to now say, okay, we have stopped hunger and poverty and sanitation. Now let's just do an energy transition. It's not a siloed, stage of development. India, for example, we have 1.5 billion people. We've recently become the most populous country in the world, and 500 million people, 500 million people of them till 10 years ago did not have a social identity number, they did not have bank accounts, and they did not have any connectivity. We did not have that many people accounted for in any formal framework, right? So, but they exist, right? And they have to be acknowledged. So now they have started getting, let's say, homes, water connections. That is also a priority in addition to transition. So when we kind of come in and say, okay, stop this, do that, prescriptions, no, I think there has to be a rationalization of expectation globally. And that is where us giving our point of view becomes very, very important. That what is actually, why are we doing what we do? And I think Fernanda mentioned that you have to decouple the economic growth from emissions and the energy sources and so forth. And that's very, very important because these two things are not linked to each other. And I just want to close this first half by saying that some of the things that India, for example, included in G20 disaster risk reduction working group. That is different from disaster management, where a disaster hits and then you're scrambling to save lives. If somebody saved, great. If not, you're a statistic, you're dead. Even if you're not dead, you've lost livelihoods forever. Millions and millions of people in the global south are at risk. So introducing a risk reduction at the G20 level acknowledges that there's an economic and life cost that needs to be formally looked at. Similarly, if you look at the framework working group, now we are looking at the macroeconomic impacts of energy transition on sectors like power or agriculture or industry and the impacts of that on the global stage. The other thing of that we are looking at again from the energy transition working group is if we transition to certain energy sources, where are the critical minerals coming from? What are the supply chains? Where is the security over the next 25, 30, 40, 50 years for our people? Because if you go down the wrong pathway now, then we are not going to be able to backtrack from there arbitrarily at another point of time. So with this, I'm going to sort of close this part. And these are the conversations that I think we will continue from Brazil's G20 to South Africa as well, but also we are having the same thing as, let's say, Summit of the Future. We're going to have the same conversations at the Global South Policy Dialogue that's coming up in Rio. We're going to have it at multiple forums. It's not just one injection point to say that this is what matters.
Sure, Shiva. I think that's this troika and also when with G20 in Indonesia under Indonesia presidents, they are opportunities also to the civil society strengthening. And I think that I can see from Brazil how we are better prepared to face this discussion. So, as you say, now we are building our narratives and connecting in a better way these macroeconomic issues with our basic rights, our social challenges, and I think that's, for me, it's a great opportunity to build this more civil society more stronger to make their voice being heard, and to be able to take action and to impact on this discussion, and to each year be more prepared to contribute in these debates, and also have this tracking process, because in the end of the day, we don't have an official platform where you can track all the commitments and all the statements that have been done in the last G20, and what were achieved or not. And the civil society is doing this role, is playing this role. So I think for me, it's clear this process of engagement and learning and better understanding about how to connect all these challenges we are facing. Thank you, Shuba. Now I'd like to invite Inácio Lara to share his insights with us. Inácio is a political scientist with a master degree in markets and institutionals of the global systems from ACERI in Italy and a PhD in institutions and policies from Università Cattolica del Sacro Cuore in Italy also. He has extensive experience in university teaching, as well as in the public and third sectors across not only Argentina, but Italy and Spain. Inácio served as the head of the cabinet for the vice president of the Generalitat Valenciana in Spain, and he is currently a product manager at Assunto del Sur in Argentina. Inácio, you are a member of T20 task force. T20 is the think tank, the engaged group from think tanks around the world. Task Force 2 was related to sustainable climate action and inclusive just energy transition. And you are inside Task Force 2 and in subtopic 1, yes? So subtopic 1 discussed how to foster the just dimension of transition plans through institutional capacity building, technology transfer, and adequate funding, something that Shuva has talked a little bit about. You played a key role in reviewing, I don't know how, but hundreds policy briefs, more than 300, I think, policy briefs. And can you share your insights on that process? And I'm curious about how do you prioritize all this? And highlights which topics stood out to you as particularly interesting. And additionally, I would like to know from you, what policy recommendations do you think we should bring in a more really considering the most important to COP30 to foster fruitful discussion and achieve tangible outcomes?
Okay. Well, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank E+ Energy Transition for organizing this side event and for proposing an informed dialogue on the Global South vision of the energy transition that we are undergoing. I'm honored to share this space with such talented experts and some friends that I had the opportunity to meet recently in Rio. Regarding your question, well, this is the first time that I have participated in a T20 process representing Asuntos del Sur. So the first thing I can say is that so far it has been an incredibly enriching experience. I have had the opportunity to meet and exchange ideas and experiences with very talented people from different countries who are approaching the energy transition agenda from very different perspectives. So, as you mentioned, we were in subtopic 2.1, so it's promoting sustainable, inclusive, and equitable energy transition. That's quite a title, of course, challenging, but for me and also for Asuntos del Sur, this framework allowed us to delve into some issues that are sometimes, I don't say always, but sometimes missing in a traditional energy transition debate. But before I discuss these issues, I would like to say a few words about the process. Yes, we were in the subtopic that received the largest number of proposals, and yes, we had to work very hard to meet deadlines and then get back to our regular works. But it is also true that the way we work within the subtopic, together with E+ and the Center for Energy Studies of Rice University from the US, it made it easier. We had very interesting discussions, especially in the last phase of the assessments when we had to evaluate the final version of policy briefs. Then a second key moment for me, being part of this process, was the midterm conference in Rio in early July. Until then, everything had been done and coordinated online. But this face-to-face meeting was incredibly useful as long as we could devote more time to discussing and learning from each other. and to start the task of completing the G20 recommendations, both those cross-cutting recommendations and sectoral recommendations, with proposals for implementation measures. So, as far as the G20 Brazil process is concerned, it has been an amazing experience. The Brazilian colleagues are exceptional hosts, and I have no doubt that the final summit in November will live up to what we have been through so far. Then, in terms of the dimensions covered in Task Force 2, I think it's important to keep in mind the starting point. So, as it was mentioned in the final statement of Task Force 2, the recommendations were focused on providing solutions to 5 main challenges. The first one is that the inadequate institutional capacity, especially the lack of design and implementation of sustainable long-term plans, and also normative and financial weaknesses. Then the second one is the limited access to finance, especially when it comes to climate adaptation measures. In third place, the challenge of unsustainable economic practices, and an issue that is directly linked to fossil fuel subsidies, but not only with this topic. In fourth place, we find the insufficient participation and ownership by local communities, especially indigenous and traditional communities. And finally, the lack of standardization and integration of social and biodiversity indicators. So, with the exception of this last topic of indicators, which is more specific and much needed issue, the rest of the challenges were present in the proposals that were delivered to subtopic 2.1. So, regarding the topic of the policy brief that we had to evaluate and to assess, I think that those that managed to balance different dimensions of the energy transition and not just focus on the fuel debate or the availability of critical minerals, those were the most attractive, at least for me. For example, the policy brief, there was a policy brief that included the energy, but also environmental and socioeconomic issues better capture the complexity and urgency of coordinated action, both within but also between states. It was also interesting when some work highlighted the impact of the necessary changes of this transition on vulnerable communities, especially from developing countries, as this is often a missing dimension in mainstream studies. In this sense, I think that the inclusion of studies and perspective from the global south is a key element in this regard, because we know that it is not the same, for example, to reduce energy subsidies in the industrialized world compared to the developing countries. For another example is that there have been some policy briefs that have stressed the opportunity to promote decentralized renewable energy systems in rural areas of the developing world. This is a key issue as long as the world has hundreds of millions of people without access to electricity. So without this type of initiative, with this type of initiatives, you can achieve many goals such as universal access to electricity, CO2 mitigation, and also socioeconomic progress in marginalized areas. So, in my case, I appreciate those policy recommendations that were comprehensive, identifying the changes needed within a broader framework or economic policies linked to development. Again, this is a key issue in developing countries. Then I found it very interesting that some policy briefs focus on global governance for a just transition. And I would like to make a brief statement on the concept of just transition, because this implies that we are not just focusing on clean technologies or fuels to reduce CO2 emissions, but on a transition that needs to be something more than that, especially for the people in the global south. For example, there are regions like Latin America or Africa which are not big CO2 emitters, but face enormous challenges in terms of poverty reduction and equity in terms of income distribution, and they still need to make this transition. So, the energy transition has to include the debate about the sustainable economic development needed to support it, and the mechanisms needed to finance it. And this is where the just component meets the global governance component, because we need to build bridges between the national and the international sphere to promote a new global governance that is responsive to the different kind of challenges that energy transition pose to countries in the north and in the south. Then, continuing with the assessment of the policy brief that we found, many policy briefs have pointed pointed out that the need to introduce multi-level and multi-stakeholder mechanisms into the multilateral arrangement responsible for addressing energy transition. And in this regard, it is crucial to include historically excluded actors in these processes. In my view, only by broadening and deepening forms of cooperation through national governments and by involving and connecting other actors can a triple aim be achieved. So anchoring the global agenda in local needs and demands, engaging all actors involved, and strengthening the legitimacy of decisions. But regarding the policy recommendations that should be included in COP30, as you asked, I think that financing is an unavoidable issue, but not only financing for technologies to produce energy from renewable sources or to improve the energy efficiency of economies, which is important, but it is not enough. As I said before, financing is needed for development, for integral development, not just for increasing economic activity. We need to find a way in which we can make important progress in this area without being predatory with the environment we are in, a model that puts dignity of people at the center. There's no point in having access to funding for large, supposedly green infrastructure projects that end up having a negative impact on the environment or have no concrete benefit for the communities in which they are built. Finally, just to conclude, we need to improve the effectiveness of global summits. This is also a suggestion for the COP30. In addition to strengthening and maintaining participatory spaces where different sectors, business, civil society, academia, can contribute to the global agenda, as we did in the G20 process, we definitely need a series of commitment to both reaching a more ambitious consensus and then implementing the decisions agreed or taken. This is not just a question of the credibility of a global forum, as in this case, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, but a call to strengthen current global governance, whether by reforming it or building new structures. We can no longer be anchored in the past. We can no longer ignore the tremendous changes that the world has undergone in the recent decades. But above all, I think we need to remember more than ever that without serious and effective cooperation, consensus, and collaboration, the alternative is even a more precarious world. So that's what I can say up till now.
Nice, Ignacio. It's very important everything you are highlighting here, because this week there was a journalist talking about another event that's happening in Brazil, and she said, we really must understand better what is energy transition. Everyone say energy transition, but what is energy transition, in fact? So actually, I think that, and the group you are taking part in G20 brought a lot of insights, and really were able to discuss all those dimensions that must be considered when you talk about energy transition. So the access to energy, the affordability, the security, and also the impacts on the environment and on local communities when you are changing to renewable energy. When you say putting people in the center, I think that is the main issue to be considered. We cannot do all this transition in the same way we have done in the past. So financing the sustainable developments must consider all of this, must have to have price for all this impact, to have to know how to really consider people first and the well-being and the access. So it was I think it was, you have a lot of good contributions to take to G20, and certainly those groups who engaged in the discussion are much better, well prepared for take this all this dimension to the discussion at COP30 and also at G20 under African presidency. Thank you very much. So, Natalia, it's your turn. Thank you for being with us. Natalia Tsuyama is a public policy expert at the Women's Policy Subsecretariat at the state of Minas Gerais, and an environmental advocate for the Cerrado region in Brazil. And since 2023, she has served as a younger leader of the Feminist Coalition for Climate Justice under UN Human Generation Equality Initiative. Currently, she is a co-facilitator for the Working Group on Environmental, Climate Just and Just Energy Transition at C20, the Civil Society Engagement Group of the G20. And additionally, she is a national advisor for the T20, the engagement group for think tank. So, Natalia, you was one of the main organizers of C20. It was a challenge task because I remember the first meeting of C20, and there are hundreds of people, I don't know, almost 80, 100 people want to take part of this. So I can imagine how the work you and other people that has the lead to do this work has to organize and to make the process keep going, and you have a limit, a timeline to deliver the work. Congratulations for you and for all the team from C20. In the working group on energy transition that you take part, I'd like you to share your experience and insights for about the work and your role also. And please tell us, in your view, how has civil society really been able to influence the G20 discussion on energy transition? And what strategies do you believe civil society can adopt to effectively engage in COP30 and drive meaningfully progress on decarbonization efforts? I think in Brazil, we have, I think that we had a certain number of organizations working in the energy agenda, but I know that nowadays we have much more this ecosystem of civil society tracking the agenda of energy are bigger. And I think that C20 made this happen.
Thank you, Teresa. As the co-facilitator of the working group on environment, climate justice, and energy transition at the C20, which is the civil society engagement group within the G20, my experience has been deeply shaped by the need to ensure that civil society voices were not only heard, but also actively integrated into the discussion on energy transition. The process of organizing this work group was challenging. It was very challenging. I think me and Stella and Enrique from CAN and the Climate Observatory were like exhausted by some point, but was very rewarding, given the complex global dynamics surrounding the climate action and the energy systems that we are living. Civil society, for sure, play a crucial role in the G20 energy transition debates by bringing a much needed perspective that center on justice, inclusivity, and community-driven solutions. I believe one of the key contributions was highlighting the social dimension of the energy transition, not just the technological and economic aspects. And this is critical because the transition to renewable energy needs to be fair, needs to be inclusive, and particularly for those who are most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and the economic shifts that accompany it. Well, civil society organizations, the CSOs, including the grassroots movements that are very important, NGOs and the academic experts, were instrumental in advocating for policies that prioritize climate justice. I believe they brought attention to marginalized groups such as indigenous people, low-income communities, and workers in fossil fuel-dependent sectors. And that was by ensuring that these voices were represented in the discussions. These groups often suffer way disproportionately from the effects of the climate change and are at risk of being left behind in this transition to the cleaner energy. In this process, civil society pushed for policies that ensure that the transition is not only swift, but also socially equitable, avoiding the deepening inequalities. I believe that another major contribution of civil society was challenging the notion of the one-size-fits-all energy transition. We stress the importance of considering local context and realities, particularly in developing countries and emerging economies, where energy poverty remain a pressing issue. We emphasize the need for accessible, affordable, and reliable clean energy solutions that cater to the specific needs of those regions. This type of contextual understanding help us to prevent the energy transition from becoming a top-down process driven solely by economic or geopolitical interests. Civil society also played a watchdog role, holding governments and corporations accountable for their commitments and by pushing for transparency and stronger climate actions. We ensured that promises made by G20 leaders were aligned with the urgency of the climate crisis. And one of the most effective ways civil society influenced the debates was by presenting concrete policy proposals that were built around the needs for a just energy transition, advocating for creation of green jobs, investments in renewable energy technologies, and support for vulnerable communities in the process of shifting away from fossil fuels. This advocacy was crucial because it offered solutions rather than just the criticism to governments and policymakers. Proposals also included the frameworks for reducing emission, promoting energy efficiency, and increasing the share of renewables in national energy mixes. The civil society engagement was not limited to discussion. It actively influenced the outcomes of the G20 energy transition agenda. Through the participation of the working groups, we have consultations and public forums. CSOs helped to shape the commitments made by the 20 countries, ensuring that sustainability, human rights, and climate justice were at the forefront. When we look ahead to COP30 in Brazil, I believe the lessons learned from the G20 process are directly applicable. And civil society role will be even more crucial in advocating for decarbonization efforts. civil society needs to continue to play a central role in shaping the international climate agenda. At COP30, we can engage with governments and negotiators by proposing actionable policies that ensure the just and sustainable energy transition. And this includes advocating for a stronger national determined contribution, the NDC, under the Paris Agreement, and ensuring that countries commit to ambitious decarbonization targets. We can also participate in the official COP30 side events and negotiations, bringing forward detailed proposals that reflect the needs and concerns of especially the most vulnerable communities. And beyond the formal negotiating, civil society is crucial in mobilizing public opinion and increasing political pressure on governments to act. Grassroots movements and campaigns can amplify the urgency of decarbonization, especially when target public officials and industries, as we seen in these years of COP. Large-scale mobilizations such as climate marches or digital campaigns can bring also a significant attention to the need for this urgent climate action, pushing the governments to take more steps during COP30. So, especially given that COP30 will take place in Brazil, it's a huge opportunity to place the challenges and opportunities of the global south in the forefront of these discussions. Civil society in Brazil and other developing countries can push for a climate agenda that recognizes its unique needs and this means advocating for more financial, for more technological support from the developed countries, ensuring that these developed nations can transition, the developing nations can transition to renewable energy without sacrificing their economic development goals. By elevating these global south voices, civil society can help ensure that global climate solutions are truly inclusive. For example, Engagemundo Youth Association that I'm a part of have been playing pivotal role in elevating the voices of Global South, particularly in the lead up to COP30 by focus on youth mobilization, climate just advocacy, and the amplification of the perspectives of the marginalized communities in Brazil and other Southern Hemisphere countries. One of our organization's main strategies is engaging in empowering young people to take leadership roles in climate negotiations and international forums, ensuring that their voices and experience in their territories are heard in the global crisis discussion as important as COP30. We have actively working to provide to these young people from the Global South the platforms they need to participate in the international climate negotiation, particularly through initiatives like organizing the Regional Conference of Youth this year in Belém, the ARCOI. And this is a preparatory event that leads up to the annual UN Climate Change Conference, the COP, and it's designed to gather young climate activists from across Latin America and Caribbean to make a statement, an agreed statement to COP. And civil society's unique positioning to showcase initiatives, solutions that already being implemented in the local level. These solutions can be brought to the global stage at the COP30 when they can inspire broader adoption, for example, community-led renewable energy projects, forest conservation initiatives, and sustainable agricultural practice that can offer scalable models for decarbonizations. Sharing these examples at COP can help demonstrate that climate action is already happening on the ground, and these efforts need to be supported and explained. So, to sum up, I think I'm past a little bit of my time. The process of organizing the energy transition work group on the C20 highlighted the pivotal role that civil society plays in shaping the global climate policy. And when we advocate for a just and inclusive transition, holding decision makers accountable and providing concrete policy solutions, civil society can drive meaningful change. As we approach COP30 in Brazil, I think it's critical that civil society continues to be a powerful force, ensuring that the global community not only commits to decarbonization, but does so in a way that prioritizes social justice and equity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Natalia. I'd like to invite Jordan McLean. Jordan, okay, now I can see you. Thank you. Jordan is a researcher in the Climate and Natural Resource Program at South Africa Institute of International Affairs. She holds a master's degree in political science from the University of Witwatersrand. Her research focuses on international platforms like the G20 and BRICS, exploring the role of the Global South in guiding the international climate change agenda, particularly concerning the global energy transition. Jordan, we know, first of all, I'd like to congratulate you, not only because South Africa will assume the next presidency of G20, but also because SAIA, the organization, where are you from, is going to be the co-lead of T20 under the South African presidency. And given that, in what way do you think the South Africa and Brazil could cooperate next year under the South Africa G20 presidency? And what are the opportunities do you see for mutual support in advancing climate initiatives, not only consider the G20 space, but other opportunities?
Thank you so much, Teresa, and thank you as well to the Energy Transitions E+ Institute for convening this space for us to share our views on G20 and COP30 coordination next year. I think it's a perfect time to really accelerate these conversations. Especially, I'm also grateful for hearing about more insights into IPEA's work on T20. We've been following it quite a lot here at the Institute, and hearing more about the outcomes of the task forces and the synergies that are possible with the C20. As Brazil's T20 Coordinating Committee experienced following on from India's T20 chair, we recognize that these are big shoes that we must fill as we take over the Think 20 mantle at the end of this year. But SAI will be joined by the Institute for Global Dialogue, as well as the Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation in this endeavor with the Think 20. And at the same time, we expect a lot of synergies in this handover because of the strategic alignment of South Africa and Brazil on core issues of development and international cooperation. So as we know, this has been quite a difficult and tumultuous year for both the global north and the south, with many elections happening across the world, including in South Africa. And these changes, and sometimes even continuations in leadership, all impact how the energy transition and commitment to ambitious climate policy is either prioritized or sidelined. In South Africa's case, our elections this year have led to a new government of national unity, where different political parties now have a sort of a seat at the table with governance and have a stronger voice in our policymaking, thus offering new opportunities to evaluate how we will execute our transition in a fair and an inclusive manner. Seeing Brazil's emphasis on bringing the G20 together to work through just transitions is important as well for South Africa's agenda, and gives us the negotiating room in 2025 to advance these kinds of conversations even further. The G20 has always been a vehicle for bridging economic divides by bringing the developed and emerging economies together to chart this course, for global development. And really, as G20 president, the host country has the opportunity to further deepen and enrich North-South relations and build on the momentum of previous presidencies. For South Africa, this is well recognized by our President Cyril Ramaphosa and our new Minister of International Cooperation, Ronald Lamola, perhaps more importantly as we prepare to welcome the United States to the new Troika, who are also due to go through quite an exciting election period. This will also be an opportunity for engaging directly with a global economic leader on the Global South agenda, together with Brazil in the new Troika. A G20 leaders declaration is really a negotiated output that requires significant stewardship and the constant attention to the outcomes of other forums in order to ensure that the G20 is continuing to build ambition. We saw India's achievements in arriving at a communique at the height of both a global pandemic and large-scale insecurity in Europe. India's very ambitious sustainability agenda, together with the admission of the African Union, which happened during their presidency. And now really Brazil is back, right, with President Lula, and there's a real enthusiasm and appetite for real action to address climate issues, hunger, poverty, and inequality. So South Africa's approach must be equally robust and brave in these tense international times. But on top of this, there's an added layer to this time in international cooperation, as Brazil also will host COP30 next year. So 2025 becomes this pivotal year for the global climate agenda, as 5 years remain really to mitigate and try to adhere to the temperature guides that the climate scientists have provided us. And of course, it will also be a year, as Natalia mentioned, for updating our nationally determined contributions on more ambitious terms. Equally, it's also 5 years to the 2030 to supposedly achieving the 2030 UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we have seen that progress on development has really been backsliding. Lack of progress on both of these agendas further entrenches their negative impacts, especially for poor and vulnerable people. And having two countries of the South guiding these two key policy forums can really advance solutions, which is key. As some of you may have seen at the UN General Assembly this last week, South Africa presented a first insight into some of our G20 priorities, and there is substantial overlap with Brazil's G20 agenda and what we could also expect from Brazil for the agenda for COP30. So South Africa operates in 2025 under the theme of solidarity, equality, and sustainable development. And I think you can see that this really builds on some elements of Brazil's own theme this year, which is building a just world and a sustainable planet, and has some linkages as well to India's theme. There are 6 priority areas that have broadly been stated by our Minister of Foreign Affairs, Minister Lamola, which include accelerating the achievement of the SDGs, reforming of the international institutions of finance as well as trade, and critically from an African perspective, dealing with issues of debt vulnerability and of course climate change. He was very clear to outline some other focus areas as well for South Africa, which include the blue economy, industrialization, which for us has to be on green and sustainable terms, and green strategic mineral governance, which is quite interesting. Africa's debt crisis is having a marked impact on the ambition and the pace of renewable energy development on the continent. And this delays both the energy transition for emitting countries like South Africa, as well as the expansion of energy access in a green and sustainable manner for other countries on the continent. South Africa will need to leverage its strategic partners on these kinds of financial issues like Brazil and India to advance the call from the South for an equitable global financial order. These focus areas have their own place in decisions, and so an effective feedback loop from Brazil and from South Africa and Brazil's coordination as G20 Troika members, as well as their coordination as partner countries in various negotiating groups in the UNFCCC or COP will be quite essential. We ideally want both of the decisions in these forums to almost keep on outdoing each other in terms of raising ambition. Brazil and South Africa also have the appetite to drive this and are good representatives of the South regarding climate and energy transitions. Both continue to reinforce the common but differentiated responsibilities principle and voice the concerns of developing countries when it comes to critical transition aspects, such as technology transfer, equitable and accessible financial flows, and of course, the opposition to unilateral measures that undermine growth and prosperity. I also think that as Brazil hosts G20, it's strategic for South Africa to look at Brazil for leadership on the climate agenda, especially as we see more and more almost encroachment of these voluntary G20 commitments at the tops, but without the necessary strategies for implementation. And so coordination and communication between the two presidencies will be key. The G20 is not a COP negotiation group, nor is the G20 representative enough of the most affected countries by climate change. So the two platforms must really work together towards a singular vision of a low carbon future, and by leveraging the two synergies that they've already identified will be extremely pivotal. South Africa's stewardship of the G20 and our good relations and historic partnership with Brazil will allow the two forums to work to support each other to advance ambition and effective implementation of commitments, rather than creating any kind of confusion and risk undermining each other. Additionally, maintaining some continuity with Brazil's agenda this year will allow South Africa to build on the momentum that Brazil has already put in place, especially regarding climate finance and energy transitions, which were two key priorities of the work that we see coming out of Task Force Klima. We do hope to see as well the initiative of bioeconomy taken forward by South Africa to advance nature-based solutions. And just also to note that South Africa has committed critically to reviewing the first cycle of the G20 with a focus on strategies for implementation and support from Global South presidencies as well. And I think that will be really interesting for us to watch and keep note of, because it is a pivotal year in 2025, where we want to see all of these different agendas and all of these different forums kind of converge really on ambition and strategies to implement these ambitious policy proposals. And I think I will leave it there just for a start. Thank you.
Thank you, Jordan. Now, I think I'm going to share questions, and I inviting all of you to answer. I would like that considering the industry decarbonization topic, that's very crucial for all of our nations. What valuable insights have you gained, especially during this G20 in Brazil discussions, and how can these insights not only inform your next role and in your next participation in South Africa G20, but also inside in your countries? What really are the most actual and important discussions that you should consider in developing your strategies, even in your work when you come back to your countries? I'd like to invite Fernanda to start.
Thank you, Teresa, for the question. Well, I think there are several insights in my perspective from all this discussion of T20 and G20. First of all, in my perspective, is that inequality is not disconnected from climate change, as I mentioned before. And we need to think, yes, we need to think about own redistributive policies, but we have to know, to have the knowledge that it's not easy to do, and I don't think we have a solution for that yet. If you take the example of Brazilian redistributive policies that we have implemented in the 2000s that were very successful, but it were implemented in a scenario where the country was growing And it was already very difficult to implement those kind of policies because people don't want to give up of income. And if you think in a world that could, and sometimes in some scenarios to grow less, it's very difficult to think how it would be acceptable by part of the world population to give up income in order to support redistributive policies. So I think that's an open challenge that we have to think about, and we don't have solutions yet. And it takes me to the second insight that I think it's important. We need to rethink what is economic growth. I'm an economist, and economic growth is the result of the use of capital, machinery, factories, and so on, and labor, and the efficiency in which we use these two inputs in order to promote growth. The question is, if you consider, besides physical capital and constructed capital, produced capital, if you consider natural capital as well, probably our economic growth equation will change a little bit. Some economists are trying to do that, are trying to estimate the use of natural capital. And if you take it into account, you can see that the natural capital available in the world is declining, and probably our productivity in using this natural capital, the environment and the natural resources, is not increasing. So since we cannot give up economic growth because we need to improve the life standards of the share, the 50% of poorest of the world population, we need to think how to grow, how to improve life standards without consuming too much of our natural capital or our environmental resources. And that's also an open question. That's also a challenge that was not addressed, and it's also difficult to address. It takes me to the third insight that I think it's very important: the need of decoupling. I think decoupling maybe it's the big challenge if you can in fact face climate change. We have to think on solutions that could be scaled, that could be used in the whole world. So small solutions and local solutions can provide solutions for local communities and so on, but we need to think in the whole world and how to scale this kind of solutions, how to think in solutions for decoupling in a long run and a sustainable one. And I don't see, I don't know you, but I don't see how to do that without new technologies. Maybe I'm a little biased because that's my field of expertise, innovation and new technologies, but I cannot see how to increase economic growth or improving life standards of the poorest population, of the poorest people in the world, without new technologies that could change the way that we produce things and the way that we use natural resources. So I think we need focus, we need a great effort in developing new technologies, new clean technologies, and I think Brazil has a role on that because we have a very clean energy matrix, and we can work on produce even industrial goods without so much energy intensity as we have as we use now. So that's I think it's a very huge insight that we had from all those discussions about from G20. And which are our instruments so far? I think we have an important instrument that is regulation. We need to focus on how to regulate emission, to establish emission standards, how to create stricter regulations on greenhouse gas emissions, forcing industries to adopt cleaner energies, and that costs money, and people don't want to do that easily. So we need also to build a consensus on that and more pressure on that. We have to impose pollution limits as part of these new regulation standards, limits the amount of pollutants and penalties for those who do not comply with these standards. We need also to think about regulation of carbon markets and green hydrogen market, and that's very important, and that's will not be made without international collaboration. That's also very difficult. And we need to think about environmental taxonomies that are used in the world as a whole. We are in Brazil are discussing the regulation of carbon market, but it needs to be an international effort, and there are several aspects of this regulation that are not consensus yet, and that could be all this new framework of regulation could be a way out to decoupling, to rethinking the economic growth and reducing inequality. The second instrument that we have are incentives and funding. Inácio mentioned about funding and important of that, not only just funding new technologies, but funding at all. We need to think, and I don't think that we have a solution yet. I think we are considering that, we are pointing that though, look, that's a problem that we need to think more deeply. And incentives and funding, subsidies, tax incentives to green technologies, environmental taxation. We just made in Brazil a reform of our tax system, but the green tax were not adequately addressed in this tax reform, because we have so many problems in our tax system that green taxes stay behind this discussion so far. So we have in Brazil to press in order to, okay, let's discuss environmental taxation seriously and how to implement that. Starting with the most important company, Petrobras in Brazil. And again, carbon market regulation is a prerequisite to do that. Environmental taxonomy is essential to guide green investments and to avoid greenwashing and so on. So it's not an easy task, but I think we at least are on this road right now. And finally, the third instrument that we have is innovation and developing new technologies. We have to improve our investments and research and development. We have to improve public policies for innovation and sustainable technologies. And we have also in Brazil specifically to think about how to promote research on our main biomes. Cerrado is losing a lot of area. Amazon is dry right now. The firewoods is taking a lot of the country. So I think we need more research on our main biomes to think solutions more deeply. I think that would be the most important insights in my view, and there are a lot of open questions on these insights yet.
Yeah, I think that we are advancing in Brazil. I think we are in a good moment. We are now also developing the circular economy strategy. It was launched recently, and I think it's a key issue for industry decarbonization. in my view, I think we not only the consumer power, but all of the public procurement can drive this transition, also can contribute to this transition. I think that we have to, when we talk about decoupling, we talk about resource efficiency. How can we reach this? And I think that we are not considering in the production process, really, we are not considering the planetary bounds. You know the concept for a long time, but we are far away for considering. And you talk about the tax reform, and following the discussion, we know that there is a huge lobby for the business as usual. And I strongly believe that our civil society and our specialists nowadays, they are much more engaged in following the discussion of the new laws and new regulation. It was not common a few years ago, because I have been following public policies for more than 20 years. And now I see the academy and the civil society more present in the National Congress. But I think that we should considering how can you face this law before the business as usual. It's very important to know it exists. It do exists. So we have to prepare our narrative and also be supported by research and evidence to guide our proposal. And now I would like to hear from you, Shuva. What do you take to your country from this discussion about industry decarbonization? And also, how can it empower our work at next G20 in South Africa and COP30?
Thank you, Teresa, and it's been so enriching. And I want to say that, something you just said, I want to say we need to put the public back in the public policy. And, very little of public policy is about actually with the public. One of the things that I think having the G20s happen in these four countries, I went to Indonesia for the first time. I've come to Brazil for the first time this year. And hopefully I'll get to go to South Africa next year. These are geographies that I at least didn't have an opportunity or even reason to go to till this conversation has happened. And this year I'm going to Brazil at least twice. And that is where we are actually exposed to other people doing similar things instead of just reading about this in certain, and in India, when we did G20 and Indonesia did a little bit of that, but we did really at scale. We had our G20 events happen in very, very small towns. We did not have it in New Delhi and Mumbai and Bangalore like we normally do. And they were in very small cities in the northeast and in Kerala in the south and Jammu and Kashmir, Srinagar. And people were like, why? What is going on with this? But what was going on is that everyone from the prime minister to the person who's driving the buses or cleaning the streets knows that there is something going on. What is the G20? And that access or inclusion, when we say it, and that is not lip service, people are actually knowing that, okay, there is some global conversation. They don't have to become an expert in that, but they have to be informed that we're speaking on certain things at certain forums. And I think Brazil is now doing that. So now, for example, you're going to different cities. These people are then exposed to something and they become a part of a sector or a line of study that is actually very exclusive, very elite, very top down, and just we have thought it for you. So you please do not put any thought into this and just do it. It's not that, it's participative policy making that we need to have right now. So if you're talking indigenous, if you're talking traditional knowledge, this and that, where is it coming from? The people. And second point to this is the whole sanctity of data that we have. And I think what the T20 process has helped us do, especially these four countries that are doing it, is have a lot of intelligence from the emerging markets enter the global knowledge pool, which normally is very difficult for us to do because of the entry barriers into, not global, not journals and publications. I mean, it's so difficult for us, let's even get an op-ed in a foreign affairs, because those entry barriers have been put in, and we cannot either afford to publish there, or we are not considered serious enough, or you are given charity space. Oh, why don't you have a global south person over there? No, we have managed. So when we're talking of 300 policy briefs, in India we have something like 600 policy briefs. These have entered a conversation mainstream, they're archived at least online. We can refer to these things. And this is an invaluable contribution of the T20 process, the B20 process, the C40, because otherwise we do not, where do we have access to enter our thoughts into this mainstream? And then once we did a study of mapping the commitments across platforms, because you have COP in your conversation and we have G20 and all that stuff. And we actually did last year a study where we mapped the G20 countries' climate and energy transition commitments and the national strategies of these countries versus the G20 versus the long-term strategy versus they're all different for each country. And in many cases, we found two things. One, the commitments that are given internationally are very, very conservative and low ambition, because we don't want to be caught in that quagmire of having missed targets. But the countries are doing much more on the ground, especially EMDs. It's at a very, very large scale because we have very dense population. So anything we do involves a lot of people. But the headlines that come up, so and so country has not done such and such. And that negates at these forums the huge work that is happening at the national and subnational levels in these countries. So, for example, India, we have transitioned around 11 crores, 110 million households to from burning wood and biomass to LPG cylinders. Uh, and that is not considered a green energy transition, so not an energy transition, but it is an energy transition because those women were burning actual wood, etc., and they had massive health issues because of small huts where they're operating and they're cooking all day and smoke. To have clean cooking at that level for 100 million people, where the contracts were given in the name of the household's woman and not the men, to include them in the conversation, and to really make that happen at the small towns and village level, right? Because urban centers are easy to sort of show small target things. You take it to remote areas is where the challenge of distribution and scale and all that come in. This is not a story that would be caught because it's not a green energy transition. So intermittent transitions have to be mapped, and that is again where this T20 briefs or these forums where we share these experiences become important. We also do not have a credible bank of data due to IP restrictions and such. So when we say traditional knowledge, cultural heritage, very second class, all of these things. Yeah, you guys have been doing something, it's a pat on our heads, let's do this. Because formal systems of knowledge have been defined by certain entities. And we are trying to get into something and saying, okay, let us in the door. No, something that is traditional is not illegitimate. Just because it is not registered by IP of a certain institution does not make it less credible or less practical or pragmatic or whatever. So these terminologies, as somebody who's handed down these terminologies, I mean, I think we need to change this. What is traditional knowledge? Knowledge is knowledge. If it works, it's legitimate. It does not have to have a definition of what sort of knowledge it is. What is yours? Modern knowledge? So this is a class system. I mean, when we talk taxonomies and stuff, these are serious issues that we are overcoming. And we can say all this tech transfer and all that, but your tech is traditional tech. Our tech is modern tech. Our tech is IP tech. Your tech is something just orally handed down. So these are very serious issues that we are now getting a forum through all these places to actually talk. I mean, this forum that's available to me is not a charity forum that, oh, come and tell us the global south perspective. We're having a conversation on a lot of serious issues from actual practitioners' points of view. The other thing is the perception of risk. So when we talk of things like it's in G20, etc., where the investment comes in, if you look at the money not flowing into climate finance is not flowing, this is not happening, because the perception is risk is again defined by certain agencies that are not in our control. They are deciding what should be our credit rating be. What is in our control? We are not in our control. So our research on our realities and our scales of measurement and our metrics of success or develop have to be defined. Otherwise, we're using some preset scale of something. And I can say, Teresa, I don't think you're developed enough to have this conversation with me. And I'm the arbiter of that. And that's not just fair, inclusive, or any of these words that we are using over there. Right? Because we do not have access to those systems to influence them. So when we talk MDB reforms or IFA, International Financial Architecture, what access do we have to the credit rating system of that? So again, this is something we need to discuss repeatedly over these conversations. And I want to close with what you said, that building an inventory of issues and tracking them over time and sort of making sure that this conversation continues. We have, for example, between this G20, Azerbaijan's COP, South Africa's G20, and Brazil's COP, the financing for development, FFD4, is coming up. It's I think the ninth, after 9 years they're doing, the previous one was, I think, 13 years later. We have to have the same conversation in the build up to FFD4, even before we go to your COP. So each milestone has to be taken, and that same inventory. What did we discuss at Brazil's COP? What did we discuss at Brazil's G20? What did we discuss at India's? We have to keep going back and re-inventorizing these issues and tracking the progress. And we're doing that. So your civil society, where we go wrong with all this, I don't say we go wrong. Our weakness is we don't have the finances to even sustain such efforts over time. So a lot of this is us doing our thing, but just having certain platforms and saying that, hey, you know what, we're doing this, do you want to be a part of that? Even if it's loosely, some inventory is going to be made. And I want to close this with an African proverb that this time one of our counterpart think tanks has used of the New York Climate Week for the India Day, ORF, which is our think tank, is doing. And they've changed it a little bit, but I want to say the original and then what here they've changed it to. It says that till the lion learns to write, the hunter will tell the tale. And they have changed it because it's India to till the tiger learns to write, the hunter will tell the tale. So if we're going to tell our story and if we want to have our perspective, then we have to learn to write and we have to keep track of what we're writing. So I want to close with that and thank you very much for giving this platform.
Yes, and I think I agree to all the points you highlighted, but and it's very important to translate all this to common people. I think that we what this means, this commitment means to our day by day well-being, to the price we pay for from the energy. So it's very important to translate to engage people, because in Brazil now we have in few days we have elections for the municipalities. We have much more than 5,000 cities in Brazil. And yesterday, I saw a study that I think only 4 candidates from the capitals are talking about climate change in their proposal. And you have a lot of, for example, cities that have been impacted by extremely events, climate extremely event. And even all those cities, we are not talking about this very obvious connections. And you can imagine when you are talking about the G20 statements and how to tackle it, it's very important to translate, because in the end of the day, the elections should be impacted by this knowledge we have to build inside the society. It's what I believe also. Inácio, can you share with us your lessons and what are you taking to Argentina and also to the next G20 and COP30?
Well, the prospects we have in Argentina are bleak, so I don't feel that we can add something to this kind of processes. This is very sad for me to say it, but we have seen our president yesterday in the UN General Assembly, so I didn't expect nothing from our country, sadly speaking. But it's what we have now. So it's. But I would like to make two very quick comment on the whole question. Besides Argentina, and first is that there is something that leaves me with certain peace of mind, so to speak, after this G20 experience. And that is that the need to decarbonize the way we produce and consume energy, as Fernanda said before, that includes not only industry but all sectors of the economy. Well, this need to decarbonize is a reality not only for a part of civil society, the academia, think tanks, and some multilateral organizations, but above all for a growing number of economic actors. So I repeat, we cannot deprive ourselves of multi-stakeholder systems to address the energy transition. We cannot move forward without the consensus of the different sectors that make up our societies. I believe that both South Africa with the presidency of the G20 and Brazil with the organization of the COP30 in 2025, both countries should strengthen this future and improve where there is still room for improvement, which undoubtedly enrich policy recommendations and concrete actions. And then on the other hand, and just also to be quick, is I have had the satisfaction of hearing some voices and reading some work, though I would have liked it to be more widespread, warning about the danger of the approach to energy transition falling into the trap of greening the current system, a system that has already been sufficiently demonstrated to be unsustainable. I don't think it makes sense to green what is already unsustainable. Replacing all barrels, for example, with photovoltaic panels, will not allow us to assess the sustainability or equity of the energy transition. So we need to innovate, as also Fernanda said, to innovate not only in technologies, but also in the way we address these challenges. This shouldn't be interpreted as a lack of consensus on the need or the speed to decarbonize the current energy system, but rather as a need to understand and decide how to do it, at what cost, and under what consensus. This means considering an approach to the energy transition that is consistent with sustainability, in which countries make decisions not only about energy policy, but also about issues such as biodiversity conservation, deforestation policies, agricultural production models, and necessary changes in the mining industry, just to name a few. Therefore, the need for comprehensive energy transition planning, driven not only by the climate agenda, but also by the economic development and the social inclusion agendas, must become kind of a mantra that needs to be upheld in the next two global forums to lay the foundations for a system of growth and equity that will make the world we live in sustainable. So to conclude, we need to make the economy not only more sustainable, but also more equitable.
Thank you. Yes, and I think that we are still missing the connections between biodiversity and natural systems. So well, sometimes we talk about the issues in a very inside a box. And of course, the solutions will be different for each country, and in countries big like Brazil, for also the regions. So I think that what you are saying that it's not a matter of discussing the new technology, but how those technologies and those resources we have, instruments, are adapted for that reality. That include not only include the natural, the biodiversity, but also the social issues. So it's not there is not a easy solution. It's have to fit those contexts and obviously have the consensus. It's very important. Thank you. Natalia, could you jump on in the discussion, please? What are your lessons, especially regarding industry decarbonization, and how do you see this discussion helping to strengthening our transition in Brazil, considering all the society, the social aspects that we have, including the necessity of growth and to have a more strong economy. So is really how to decoupling this growth, economic growth, from the natural facts, but also how do you considering this in industrial decarbonization in our process of developing and reaching well-being for all.
Thank you, Teresa. I believe that we must shift from merely focusing on decarbonization to also promoting responsible resource extraction. The G20 and COP30, we must advocate for stricter regulations on mining practice and ensuring that the energy transition does not worsen the inequalities or exploit vulnerable regions. At the G20 in South Africa, that is a resource-rich country facing some similar challenges. We have an opportunity to lead in creating policies that demand ethical sourcing and circular economy, where recycling of materials reduce the needs for new mining ventures, for example. Another crucial lesson from G20 is the stark divide between nations that are leading in renewable energy and those still struggling with energy poverty. In Brazil, for example, despite significant progress in renewable energy, millions still lack access to renewable, reliable electricity. And these challenges is even more pronounced in the sub-Saharan Africa. At G20 South Africa, we must address how the global South can not only transition to renewable, but also solve these energy poverty through this transformation. The conversation at COP30 should center on how we make the energy transition inclusive, especially for communities that have been historically marginalized. And I believe one of the inspiring aspects of the G20 in Brazil was the country's leadership in the bioenergy and renewable innovation. Brazil has been at the forefront of using biofuels as a way to reduce carbon emissions while maintaining the energy security. But what's equally impressive is how Brazil is linking energy innovation with social inclusion. Programs that ensure low-income households can access renewable energy and initiatives that create jobs in the clean energy sectors are paving the way for a just transition. And this kind of innovation we must promote across the global South. At the G20 in South Africa, Brazil's approach can be used as a model, for example, as South Africa faced similar challenges with energy poverty and integrating social programs with energy and innovation. And that can ensure benefits for everyone, not just large corporations or wealthy individuals. And I believe that as we look towards COP30 in Brazil, these lessons become even more relevant. Brazil has the opportunity to showcase how energy policies can promote both sustainability and socio-economic equality, leading by example for the rest of the world. But the G20 power also lies, and I believe that is in the ability to connect civil society with decision makers. And in Brazil, through the C20, we ensured that grassroots voices were heard, specifically from the global South. And we brought to the table the stories of communities on the front lines of climate change, those dealing with energy poverty, environmental degradation from mining, and the challenges of transition to clean energy. And these voices must continue to shape policy discussions, both at the G20 South Africa and at COP30. And we must advocate for policies that hold corporations accountable for their environmental and social impacts, especially in the context of resources extractions for renewable. We need a global just transition framework that ensures fair labor practice, protects human rights, and limits environmental harm in the production of clean energy technologies. As we move forward to the COP30 in Brazil, it's essential that we bring the lessons learned from G20 Brazil to this global stage that the COP30 provides. And it's a critical opportunity for not only Brazil, but also the global South nations to shape this climate global agenda in the way that reflect these priorities and this kind of energy transition.
Thank you, Natalia. And I'd like to hear from you, Jordan. Do you think we, of course, we are in a different position because now we are taking this G20 in your hands with your team from the SAIA. So what do you bring? What lessons do you take to the next G20? How do you think this process can really help you to better develop your tasks, considering the industry decarbonization topic?
Thank you so much. I think right now, seeing as the broad priorities were just spoken about officially for the first time by the president and the minister, just in this past week at the UN General Assembly, I think now is a pivotal time to have more conversations like this so that really the Think 20 agenda can reflect a lot of these perspectives from the Global South. And I think there is a legacy of these Global South presidencies in the way that they have effectively raised expectations of the G20 from the developing world as a platform, as a vehicle to lead global development, and also to act as a block of countries that are kind of first movers to drive economic and energy transitions towards low carbon, inclusive, and sustainable futures. I mean, some years ago, conversations around the use of fossil fuels or social inclusion would not be this open and public and contained within a platform like the G20. So it's really southern countries that have continuously emphasized these elements and these philosophies of inclusion and sustainability that have allowed the scope of what the G20 works on to really open up. And I think what comes out of the G20 has over the years had a greater impact on how countries are approaching other international discussions. So what is happening in the COP and the kind of statements that we see within the UN. So South Africa has a huge task in rounding out this first cycle of G20 presidencies and the 4 successive Global South presidencies of the G20 as well. But I think in terms of lessons, Brazil this year has really endeavored to make its G20 presidency socially diverse and very inclusive. And that kind of also makes me think of India. I mean, I was in India for the T20 summit in Mysuru. It's a town that I'd never heard of. They're so rich culturally and has so much innovation going on as well. So a multitude of perspectives that Brazil has been able to cultivate has really driven some ambitious solution-oriented proposals that we've seen in the C20 communique, T20 communique, and that joint statement that they came out with that really tackle various aspects and various impacts of industrial decarbonization from the private sector all the way through to the impact on indigenous and vulnerable peoples. And I think one of the key innovations for me has been to see how G20 Social has kind of gained momentum. And obviously the summit is drawing very, very close as well. And I would look forward to South Africa continuing an initiative like this, given our country's multiple ethnicities. South Africa has a lot of different social groupings, and we are still kind of located as a hub for Africa with many different representatives from other countries, coming to South Africa at some stage. So also more than this, decarbonization has a heavy social impact, and it cannot be thought through without considering all of society's actors. just as Ignacio was just speaking about, the private sector, community, the role of academics and experts. And for South Africa, mining, energy, heavy industry, all of these parts of our economy support hundreds of thousands of jobs. Not to mention the indirect employment that is created from service providers within servicing these communities. And all of these jobs and these communities are set to become more precarious as we implement our just transition. And we already have this financing agreement with a cohort of northern countries to accelerate our transition away from coal. So any additional opportunity for social engagement with policy through such a huge platform like the G20, where different countries are coming together and sharing their experiences and lessons, is critical for us. Brazil's objective as well to incorporate the viewpoints and suggestions from not only the G20 engagement groups, but also civil society actors through the G20 Social Summit into the final leaders declaration. I think it's also really an important policy innovation for South Africa to watch, and a real evidence of effective and real participation in international policy making. And I think just echoing Shubha, taking G20 to the people, I think is very much on the cards for South Africa. There is such power in taking people, especially policy people, to sites like Mpumalanga in South Africa, which is a province that hosts about 90% of South Africa's coal mines and our power stations, and to show them on the ground the real impact that the transition will have on jobs and livelihoods, and how careful and managed a just transition planning really needs to be to protect people and to leave no one behind. And of course, with Task Force Klima, it's also another innovation of Brazil that offers a lot of lessons for South Africa. Almost seems to us to work to centralize climate conversation across the tracks, re-emphasizing Brazil's desire to promote inclusion and ambitious climate commitments through the G20. And I think from South Africa's perspective, having a vehicle like this and seeing the success of the creation of the initiative on the bioeconomy is also really important. For the bioeconomy initiative, it's something that we can expect for South Africa's presidency, although we haven't seen any formal notice of this yet. But the bioeconomy is an area where South Africa is leading in terms of the continent, and really is a theme that is gaining much more momentum on the continent. So last year, Kenya hosted the first African Climate Summit, and the outcome document, the Nairobi Declaration, specifically outlines how Africa's abundant natural resources offer strategic opportunities to develop these natural industries, green value chains, and their role in countering global emissions. And I think equally, Brazil has been very clear with their G20 agenda this year that adaptation remains critically underfinanced, which is another point raised from the Africa Climate Summit. And this is a grave concern for Africa as well as South Africa, because the entire energy transition, it cannot just be thought through the prism of mitigation alone. There's real adaptation needs on the continent that will have an impact on greenhouse gas emissions as well. Brazil has also taken a robust approach to some of these uncomfortable conversations around climate financing by proposing some of these innovative solutions to redistribute funds or crowd in investment. And this is a key lesson for South Africa, as well as how to navigate these tough discussion points in the G20. Very important as well for 2025 is Africa's participation. So Brazil is really providing a lot of support to the African Union to engage in the G20 as a member for the first time, which is obviously a lesson for us. But being an African country as well, South Africa has been very clear that we have a responsibility as well to advance the African agenda and ensure that the African Union is well represented in our G20 presidency. And for the Think 20 as well, I think it's a really critical platform to raise and to profile innovative African research into issues that are facing the continent. And I'm sure that we are prioritizing that in our coordination of the Think 20 policy briefs, And I mean, we've already seen a steady rise in the diversity of research in policy briefs, even before India, and real emphasis on sort of co-authoring policy briefs and policy proposals from different regions and showing how really emphasizing partnership in the research work that we produce. And also, I think it's a pivotal platform for the African Union. And I think the African Union is really watching and seeing how Brazil is leading the G20 and how to engage in this platform, because the African Union has a lot of, these African solutions for global problems. So just also what Shiva was talking about on credit rating, the African Union has just convened a retreat a few months ago to finalize African principles on a credit rating agency. So there's a lot of movement and a lot of innovation that is coming out of Africa as a continent. And, South Africa is really, I think we are trying to position ourselves as really just a conduit of profiling and platforming these kinds of solutions. So I think it will be a really interesting year. There's a lot that Brazil has put in place and built on top of from India that South Africa now has to sort of put our own spin on and ensure that there's continuous momentum. I think there's a lot of uncertainty in terms of what a G20 can look like in 2026. It relies a lot on the election that we will see next month. But in terms of South Africa, we have a lot to learn from Brazil, and I think just now with the profiling of our presidency's sort of 6 broad priority areas, I think the world can already see that we are looking for synergies and we're looking to build momentum to keep the G20, the global South presidencies of the G20 really running strong.
Thank you, Jordan. We are approaching the final. So in this panel, we talked about the opportunities the Troika, India, Brazil, South Africa can bring for the strengthening of the civil society in the Global South, highlighting the critical role civil society has in shaping the energy transition policies. We also discussed about how the work done under G20 India and G20 Brazil can serve as a foundation for discussions and actions at COP30 and G20 South Africa, emphasizing the importance of long-term global cooperation. We discussed a lot of this here. And I'd like to express my gratitude to Fernanda, Shuva, Inácio, Natalia, and Jordan to be part of this discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And I look forward to having more of these conversations. There's been so much learning in just this couple of hours. And I'll see some of you in Rio in coming weeks.
Thank you
see
very
you
much
in
also.
Brazil.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you.
you, Teresa, and also thank you, Institute. It's a pleasure.